The morning light filtered through the frosted windows of Thornton Photography Studio on Boylston Street in Boston, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. It was October 15th, 1905, and outside, the city hummed with the sounds of horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestones and vendors calling out their wares. Inside the studio, photographer Samuel Thornton adjusted the heavy brass lens of his camera, preparing for what should have been a routine family portrait session. The Harrison family had arrived precisely at 9 o'clock as scheduled. Jonathan Harrison stood near the entrance, removing his black overcoat and handing it to his wife, Catherine. He was a man of 42, with sharp features and graying temples that gave him an air of distinguished authority. As vice president of the Boston Mercantile Bank, he carried himself with the careful composure of someone accustomed to scrutiny. Catherine, younger by 7 years, wore a deep burgundy dress with a high collar, her dark hair pinned up in the latest fashion. Their 3 children, Margaret, 14, Thomas, 11, and little Emma, 7, stood quietly beside them, well trained in the art of proper behavior. Samuel had photographed countless families over his 20 years in business. He knew the routine by heart: position the father in the center, the wife slightly behind, children arranged by height. Every detail mattered in these portraits, which families would display in their parlors for generations. But something about Jonathan Harrison made him uneasy, though he could not quite identify what it was. Perhaps it was the way the man's hand kept moving to his vest pocket, fingers brushing against the gold chain of his pocket watch, or the tension visible in his jaw despite his pleasant smile. As Samuel arranged the family on the velvet-upholstered furniture he kept for such occasions, Jonathan suddenly spoke. His voice was steady, but carried an urgency that seemed out of place for such a mundane appointment. He requested that Samuel ensure his pocket watch was clearly visible in the photograph. Not just visible, he emphasized, but perfectly clear and focused. Samuel found the request unusual. Most gentlemen were content to let such details fall where they may, but he agreed without question. The customer's preferences always came first. Catherine Harrison shifted uncomfortably as her husband positioned himself in the leather chair Samuel had indicated. She exchanged a brief glance with her eldest daughter, Margaret, who had inherited her mother's dark eyes and delicate features. Something unspoken passed between them, a flash of concern that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Thomas stood rigid in his sailor suit, while Emma clutched a porcelain doll, her small fingers white with the intensity of her grip. Samuel ducked beneath the black cloth draped over his camera, adjusting the focus until the image reversed on the ground glass screen became sharp. The family arranged themselves according to his directions, Jonathan seated, his watch chain prominently displayed, Catherine standing behind him with one hand on his shoulder, the children positioned around them in descending order. Through the lens, they looked like any prosperous Boston family, posed and proper, ready to be immortalized in silver and gelatin. But as Samuel fine-tuned the focus on Jonathan's pocket watch, he noticed something that made him pause. The watch itself was extraordinary, gold-cased with intricate engravings that caught the studio lights. But it was not the craftsmanship that caught his attention. As he adjusted the lens to capture the detail Jonathan had requested, he saw that the watch face showed a specific time: 3:47. And there, barely visible in the polished gold surface of the watch case, was a reflection. Samuel squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing in that tiny, curved, mirror-like surface. Jonathan's voice cut through his concentration, sharp and commanding. Was everything ready? Samuel emerged from beneath the cloth, nodding. He loaded the glass plate into the camera, checked his calculations for the exposure time, and instructed the family to remain perfectly still. In the heavy silence that followed, broken only by the distant sounds of the city outside, Samuel removed the lens cap and began counting the seconds. The Harrison family froze in place, barely breathing, while the camera captured their image and whatever secrets that pocket watch might hold. The photograph took 3 minutes to expose properly, during which time the Harrison family remained motionless as statues. Samuel Thornton had worked with many subjects over the years, but he had never seen a family maintain such absolute stillness. Even young Emma, who could not have been more than 7 years old, did not fidget or shift her weight. It was as though they had all been holding their breath, waiting for something momentous to conclude. When Samuel finally replaced the lens cap and told them they could relax, the change in the room was immediate. Catherine Harrison's shoulders dropped, and she stepped away from her husband's chair as though released from an obligation. Margaret moved to the window, staring out at the street below with an expression Samuel could not quite read. Jonathan remained seated, his fingers once again finding that pocket watch, turning it over and over in his palm. Samuel retreated to his darkroom to begin the development process, leaving the family in the main studio. Through the partially open door, he could hear their voices, low and tense, though he could not make out the words. As he worked in the amber glow of his safety lamp, carefully removing the glass plate from its holder and sliding it into the developer bath, he found his thoughts returning to that strange reflection he had glimpsed in the watch's polished surface. The image began to emerge in the chemical bath, slowly revealing itself like a ghost, materializing from fog. Samuel watched as the Harrison family appeared, their faces becoming clearer with each passing moment. Jonathan's figure was sharp and well-defined, his suit impeccable, his posture radiating authority. But it was the pocket watch that drew Samuel's eye. He had focused on it carefully, as requested, and the detail was extraordinary. The watch face was clearly legible, showing 3:47 exactly. And there, in the curved gold surface of the case, was that reflection he had noticed through the lens. Samuel lifted the plate from the developer and held it up to the safety lamp. His hands, steady from decades of practice, began to tremble slightly. In the reflection on the watch case, impossibly small but undeniably present, was an image that should not have been there. It showed a figure, blurred and indistinct but unmistakably human, standing behind the camera, behind where Samuel himself had been standing. But Samuel had been alone in the studio with the Harrison family. He had no assistant, no other person present during the exposure. He told himself it must be a defect in the plate, a chemical artifact, or perhaps a trick of the light bouncing off the watch's curved surface. Yet as he examined it more closely, moving the plate under the lamp, he could not shake the feeling that he was looking at something intentional. The figure in the reflection appeared to be wearing dark clothing, and though the face was nothing more than a pale oval, there seemed to be a deliberate positioning to it, as though whoever it was had been careful to remain within the reflection's frame. Samuel moved the plate through the stop bath and into the fixer, his mind racing. He had photographed pocket watches before, had captured countless reflections in polished surfaces. Never had he seen anything like this. The figure was too distinct to be random reflection, too positioned to be accidental. Someone else had been in the studio standing behind his camera and had somehow escaped his notice entirely. When the plate was fixed and washed, Samuel made a contact print, wanting to see the image at actual size rather than as a negative. He waited impatiently for the print to develop, watching as the Harrison family emerged once more, this time as they would appear in the final photograph. And there it was again, that figure in the watch's reflection, tiny but present, like a signature hidden in plain sight. Samuel heard movement in the studio and quickly hung the wet print to dry. When he emerged from the darkroom, wiping his hands on his apron, he found Jonathan Harrison standing alone, his family having moved to the far corner where Catherine was helping Emma with her coat. Jonathan turned to face him, and Samuel saw something in the man's eyes that sent a chill down his spine. It was expectation mixed with something darker, perhaps fear or resignation or both. The banker spoke quietly, asking how long it would take for the photographs to be ready. Samuel gave his standard answer, 1 week for the prints, longer if they wanted additional copies. Jonathan nodded slowly, then reached into his vest and withdrew a leather wallet. He counted out twice the normal fee in crisp bills and placed them on Samuel's desk. For discretion, he said simply, and for ensuring that the watch was captured with absolute clarity. Then he turned and collected his family, and the Harrisons departed without another word. Samuel Thornton could not sleep that night. He lay in his apartment above the studio, staring at the ceiling while Boston's nighttime sounds filtered through his window. The distant clatter of a late streetcar, dogs barking, the occasional clip-clop of a horse passing below. His mind kept returning to that impossible figure reflected in Jonathan Harrison's pocket watch. By 2 in the morning, He had convinced himself to examine the photograph again, perhaps in better light, perhaps with a magnifying glass that might reveal some rational explanation. He descended the narrow staircase to his darkroom, lit the gas lamps, and retrieved the print he had made that afternoon. In the stronger light, the Harrison family stared back at him with their frozen, formal expressions. Samuel found his most powerful magnifying lens and positioned it over the pocket watch. The watch face was clear and sharp, its Roman numerals perfectly legible, the delicate hands pointing to 3:47, and there, in the polished gold case surrounding the face, was that reflection. Under magnification, details emerged that Samuel had not been able to see before. The figure was definitely human, standing in what appeared to be the exact position where Samuel had been during the exposure. But the clothing was wrong, too dark, too formal, more like funeral attire than the practical vest and shirt Samuel had been wearing. And there was something about the posture, the way the figure stood, that suggested weight and presence, not the shifting casualness of someone operating a camera. More disturbing still was what appeared when Samuel moved his magnifying glass slightly to the right, examining the next section of the watch's curved surface. There, barely visible, was what might have been a date or inscription engraved on the watch case itself. The letters were tiny, reversed in the photograph as all reflected images are, but Samuel could make them out. For J.H., until we meet again, October 1903. The date was 2 years earlier, and the inscription carried the weight of finality, of goodbye rather than simple affection. Samuel sat back, his mind working through possibilities. A gift from someone close to Harrison given 2 years ago, someone who had perhaps died or departed, given the tone of the message. And now Harrison had insisted on having this watch prominently featured in a family portrait, making sure it was captured with perfect clarity. Why? What purpose did it serve to have that reflection, that figure, present in the photograph? Morning came too quickly. Samuel had perhaps dozed for an hour or two in his chair before dawn light began creeping through the dark room's covered windows. He made coffee on his small stove and tried to convince himself to focus on the day's scheduled appointments. But his hand kept reaching for the Harrison photograph, and finally he admitted defeat. He needed to understand what he had captured, and that meant he needed to learn more about Jonathan Harrison and the story behind that pocket watch. Boston in 1905 was a city where information flowed through specific channels. Samuel knew that the Boston Mercantile Bank where Harrison worked was on State Street, not far from the studio. He also knew that banks, like most institutions, were built on relationships and reputation. If Harrison had secrets, someone in Boston's financial district would know about them. Samuel closed his studio for the morning, hanging a sign that promised his return after noon, and walked the 15 minutes to State Street. The morning was cold, with a sharp wind blowing off the harbor, and the streets were crowded with workers heading to their offices and shops. The Boston Mercantile Bank occupied an impressive granite building with columns flanking its entrance. Inside, the marble floors gleamed under electric lights, a modern touch that spoke to the institution's prosperity. Samuel approached one of the clerks and asked if he might speak with someone regarding Jonathan Harrison. The young man's reaction was immediate and telling, a flash of recognition followed by careful neutrality. He asked Samuel to wait and disappeared through a door marked Private. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When the clerk returned, he was accompanied by an older gentleman in an expensive suit, his grey beard neatly trimmed, his manner conveying authority. This was Howard Pemberton, the bank's president, and he invited Samuel into his office with a courtesy that felt strained. Once the door was closed, Pemberton's demeanor changed. He asked directly why Samuel was inquiring about Jonathan Harrison. Samuel explained that he had photographed the Harrison family the previous day and had some questions about the commission. Pemberton's face grew grave, and he walked to his window, looking out over State Street before finally speaking words that would change everything. Samuel thought he understood about that photograph. Howard Pemberton turned from the window, his expression heavy with something that looked like grief mixed with resignation. He asked Samuel to sit, then poured 2 glasses of brandy from a crystal decanter on his desk, despite the early hour. What he was about to share, he said, was not common knowledge, but given that Samuel had been brought into the situation through the photograph, he deserved to know the truth. Jonathan Harrison's wife was not Catherine, Pemberton began, or rather Catherine was his second wife. His first wife, Eleanor, had died 2 years earlier, in October of 1903, the exact date inscribed on the pocket watch. Eleanor had been Pemberton's niece, a woman of extraordinary character who had married Jonathan when they were both young. She had given him 3 children, the same 3 children who now appeared in the photograph, and had been the foundation of his life. Her death from pneumonia had been sudden and devastating, taking less than a week from first fever to final breath. Samuel listened in silence as Pemberton described Jonathan's grief. The man had been inconsolable for months, unable to work, barely able to care for his children. It was Eleanor's dying wish that Jonathan not remain alone, that he find someone to help raise their children and give them the stability of a complete family. Within a year, through the urging of well-meaning friends, Jonathan had married Catherine Winters, a widow herself who had lost her own husband to a factory accident. But the marriage was a practical arrangement, Pemberton explained, not a love match. Catherine was kind and dutiful, and she tried her best with the children, but there was a distance that could not be bridged. Margaret especially remained loyal to her mother's memory, and had never fully accepted Catherine. The household was polite but cold, a family in form, but not in feeling. And Jonathan. Jonathan carried Eleanor's pocket watch every day, the watch she had given him on their 10th anniversary with that inscription about meeting again. Samuel felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. He asked Pemberton about the photograph, about why Jonathan would have wanted that watch featured so prominently. Pemberton's answer was unexpected. He did not know. Jonathan had not confided in him about any photograph. In fact, Pemberton had not even known Jonathan had scheduled a family portrait. It was unusual, given that Jonathan avoided any activity that required him to present Catherine as his wife in formal or public ways. Samuel made a decision then, though he knew it might be seen as a violation of professional discretion. He withdrew the small print he had made of the Harrison photograph from his jacket pocket and laid it on Pemberton's desk. He pointed to the pocket watch, explaining how he had focused on it as Jonathan requested, and then showed him the figure reflected in the watch's polished surface. Pemberton leaned close, using the magnifying glass Samuel offered, and his face went pale. He knew that silhouette, he whispered. The posture, the way the figure stood. It was Eleanor. He would recognize his niece anywhere, even in such a tiny, distorted reflection. But that was impossible, he said, looking up at Samuel with confusion and something approaching fear. Eleanor had been dead for 2 years. How could she possibly appear in a photograph taken yesterday? Samuel had no answer. He explained what he knew, that he had been alone with the Harrison family during the exposure, that no one else had been in the studio, that he could not explain the figure's presence in the reflection. Unless, he suggested hesitantly, someone had been there, someone they had all somehow failed to notice. But even as he said it, he knew how absurd it sounded. Pemberton stood and walked to his office door, checking that it was firmly closed. When he returned to his desk, he spoke in a low voice about something he had never told anyone. In the weeks before Eleanor's death, she had become convinced that something was going to happen to her. She had no reason to think so. She had been healthy, active, showing no signs of illness, but she had told Pemberton that she felt her time was limited and that she needed to make sure Jonathan would be cared for. She had made him promise to watch over her husband and children after she was gone. More significantly, Eleanor had told Pemberton that if anything happened to her, she would find a way to remain present in her family's life. She would not abandon them completely, she had said. At the time, Pemberton had dismissed it as emotional talk from a woman who was perhaps feeling melancholy. But now, looking at this photograph with its impossible reflection, he was not so sure. Eleanor had been a woman of extraordinary will. If anyone could have found a way to insert herself into a family portrait 2 years after death, it would have been her. Samuel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He asked the question that had been forming since he first saw the reflection. Had Jonathan known? Had he deliberately positioned that watch, focused Samuel's attention on it, knowing what would appear in the reflection? Was the entire photograph a message, a proof, a connection to someone who was supposed to be gone? Pemberton's question hung in the air between them like smoke. Samuel had no certain answer, but the more he considered it, the more convinced he became that Jonathan Harrison had known exactly what would appear in that photograph. The insistence on perfect focus, the specific positioning of the watch, the doubled fee for discretion. These were not the actions of a man commissioning an ordinary family portrait. These were the actions of someone executing a carefully designed plan. But to what end? Samuel asked the question aloud, and Pemberton's response was slow in coming. He suggested that perhaps Jonathan wanted proof, tangible evidence that Eleanor had not truly left him, that some part of her remained connected to the family she had loved. Or perhaps it was a message to his children, particularly Margaret, who had struggled so deeply with her mother's death. A way of showing them that Eleanor was still watching over them, still present in some form they could see and hold. Samuel considered another possibility, one that made him uncomfortable to voice, but seemed increasingly plausible. What if Jonathan intended to show the photograph to Catherine? What if this was his way of telling his second wife that she would never truly replace Eleanor, that the first Mrs. Harrison maintained a claim on the family that death itself had not severed? It would be cruel, but grief could make people cruel, especially when combined with guilt over remarrying. Pemberton's face darkened at this suggestion. He admitted that he had worried about Jonathan's state of mind since Eleanor's death. The man had never properly grieved, had instead thrown himself into work and then into a hasty remarriage that seemed designed more to satisfy social expectations than any genuine desire for companionship. Perhaps this photograph was a manifestation of something breaking inside him, a desperate attempt to hold on to what he had lost, while simultaneously pushing away what he had gained. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in thought. Finally, Samuel asked the practical question. What should he do? The photographs were due to be delivered to the Harrison household in 6 days. Should he include the print that showed the reflection so clearly, or should he make new prints with that detail somehow obscured? It was technically possible to retouch the negative, to paint out the troubling reflection in the watch's surface, though doing so would go against every professional standard Samuel held. Pemberton's answer was firm. Samuel should deliver the photographs exactly as they were, without alteration or comment. If Jonathan had orchestrated this situation deliberately, then he deserved to receive what he had paid for. If it was somehow accidental, some trick of light and chemistry that neither of them understood, then Jonathan needed to see it and draw his own conclusions. The truth, whatever it might be, belonged to the Harrison family, not to Samuel or Pemberton. But Pemberton added one request. He wanted Samuel to make an additional print for him, one that he could keep locked in his desk. As Eleanor's uncle and the family's closest connection, he felt entitled to possess this strange artifact, this impossible image that might be the last glimpse of his beloved niece. Samuel agreed, though he felt uneasy about duplicating the photograph without Jonathan's explicit permission. Professional discretion had its limits when confronted with situations this far outside normal experience. Over the following days, Samuel tried to focus on his regular work, but he found his attention constantly drawn back to the Harrison photograph. He made the prints Jonathan had ordered, 6 copies in total, each showing the family in formal pose, each containing that mysterious reflection in the pocket watch's polished surface. He made an additional print for Pemberton as promised, and one more for himself, though he could not have explained exactly why he felt compelled to keep a copy. On the 6th day, October 21st, Samuel packaged the photographs carefully in stiff cardboard and brown paper, sealing them with wax, as he did for all his important commissions. He wrote the Harrison address on the package in his careful hand and set it aside for delivery. But before he could arrange for a messenger, there came a knock at his studio door. Samuel opened it to find young Thomas Harrison standing on his doorstep, his face pale and his eyes red-rimmed as though he had been crying. The boy spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, asking if the photographs were ready. Samuel confirmed that they were, and Thomas held out an envelope, explaining that his father had sent him to collect them and to deliver this letter. Samuel accepted the envelope, noting that it was sealed with black wax, and handed over the package of photographs. Thomas clutched it to his chest and turned to leave, but Samuel stopped him with a gentle hand on his shoulder, asking if everything was all right at home. Thomas looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for an 11-year-old boy. He said simply that his father had been acting strangely all week, spending hours in his study with his mother's pocket watch, muttering to himself about promises and proof. His sister Margaret was worried, and even Catherine seemed frightened, though she tried to hide it. Then Thomas pulled away and ran down Boylston Street, disappearing into the afternoon crowds while Samuel stood in his doorway with Jonathan Harrison's letter heavy in his hand. Samuel retreated into his studio and locked the door behind him, his hands trembling slightly as he broke the black wax seal on Jonathan Harrison's letter. The paper inside was expensive, the kind used by banking executives for important correspondence, and the handwriting was precise but showed signs of stress in its occasional wavering strokes. Samuel moved to his desk, where the afternoon light was strongest, and began to read. The letter opened with an acknowledgement of what Samuel must have noticed in the photograph, the figure reflected in the pocket watch's surface. Jonathan did not attempt to explain it or justify it. Instead, he wrote that Samuel had been chosen for this commission specifically because of his reputation for technical excellence and absolute discretion. Jonathan had needed a photographer who would capture every detail with perfect clarity, someone who would not flinch from what the camera revealed, even if what it revealed seemed to defy rational explanation. What followed was a confession of sorts, though its meaning remained frustratingly unclear. Jonathan wrote that 2 years ago, as his first wife Eleanor lay dying, she had made him promise something extraordinary. She had been terrified not of death itself, but of being forgotten, of watching her children grow up without her, of being replaced in her own home by someone who had not earned the right to mother them. In her fever and pain, she had extracted from Jonathan a vow that he would find a way to keep her present in the family's life, to ensure that the children never forgot who their real mother was. At first, Jonathan had interpreted this as a simple request to preserve Eleanor's memory through stories and photographs, to speak of her often and fondly. But Eleanor had insisted it meant more than that. She wanted to be there, truly present, not just remembered, but actively participating in family moments she would never live to see. Jonathan had promised, not fully understanding what she was asking, desperate to give his dying wife whatever comfort he could offer. In the months after Eleanor's death, Jonathan had become obsessed with that promise. He had remarried out of obligation and practical necessity, knowing the children needed a mother's care, but every moment with Catherine felt like a betrayal of Eleanor's memory. The children sensed his ambivalence, and the household had become a place of careful politeness rather than genuine warmth. Margaret in particular had grown cold and distant, barely speaking to Catherine, spending hours in her mother's old room touching Eleanor's belongings as though they were sacred relics. Then, 3 weeks ago, something had happened that Jonathan described only obliquely. He had been sitting in his study late at night, examining Eleanor's pocket watch as he often did, when he had noticed something in its reflective surface that should not have been there. He did not specify what he had seen, but whatever it was had convinced him that Eleanor had found a way to keep her promise. She was still present, still watching, still connected to the family through some means he did not understand but could not deny. That was when he had conceived the idea of the photograph. If Eleanor could manifest in the reflection of her watch, then perhaps a camera could capture that manifestation permanently. The photograph would serve multiple purposes: proof for himself that he was not losing his sanity, evidence for the children that their mother had not truly left them, and perhaps most importantly, a message to Catherine about the true nature of their marriage. She was the children's caretaker, Jonathan wrote with brutal honesty, but she would never be their mother. That role was still occupied, still claimed, still held by the woman whose reflection appeared impossibly in a pocket watch she had given him when she was alive. Samuel read this section twice, disturbed by its implications. Jonathan Harrison was not seeking comfort in this photograph. He was seeking a weapon. He intended to use it to maintain the painful status quo of his household, to prevent any genuine affection from developing between his children and Catherine, to ensure that his second marriage remained exactly what it had started as, a practical arrangement devoid of love or true partnership. The letter concluded with instructions. Samuel was to deliver the photographs as planned, and to speak to no one about what they contained. Jonathan had paid for discretion as well as technical skill, and he expected both. If Samuel violated this confidence, Jonathan made clear there would be professional consequences. He had connections throughout Boston's business community, and he could ensure that no respectable family would commission portraits from Thornton Photography Studio again. But there was also a final paragraph, added in writing, that looked even more unsteady than the rest. Jonathan wrote that if Samuel believed there was something wrong in what he had done, if the photographer's conscience troubled him, then perhaps Samuel was right to feel that way. Jonathan himself no longer knew if his actions were those of a devoted husband keeping a sacred promise, or those of a grieving man clinging to something that needed to be released. He asked no forgiveness and offered no justification beyond the simple fact that he had done what he believed Eleanor wanted, and he would have to live with whatever consequences followed. Samuel set the letter down and walked to his window, looking out at Boston's busy streets without really seeing them. He thought about Eleanor Harrison, dying and desperate, extracting promises that her husband should never have made. He thought about Catherine, trying to build a life in a house haunted not by ghosts but by an idealized memory she could never match. He thought about the children, especially Margaret, caught between loyalty to a dead mother and the possibility of accepting care from a living one. And he thought about the photograph itself, that image he had captured with such technical precision, not understanding that he was creating something that would serve not as a family treasure, but as a tool of emotional manipulation. He had been used, certainly, but he had also been complicit. He had taken Jonathan's money and asked no questions, had focused that camera exactly where he was told to focus it, had captured that reflection with perfect clarity. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. The photographs had been delivered. Jonathan would show them to his family, and whatever happened after that would happen regardless of Samuel's wishes. But Samuel still had his own copy of the print, and Pemberton had his. These were evidence of something. Samuel was no longer sure what, and they represented a responsibility he had not asked for, but could not escape. 3 days passed before Samuel heard anything more about the Harrison family. He went about his usual business, photographing merchants and their families, capturing portraits of young women in their finest dresses and children in their Sunday clothes, all while his mind kept returning to that impossible reflection and Jonathan Harrison's disturbing letter. He had decided to do nothing, to let events unfold as they would, but the decision sat uneasily on his conscience, like a weight he could not shift. On the afternoon of October 24th, a cold rain began falling over Boston, turning the streets muddy and driving people indoors. Samuel was cleaning his equipment when he heard urgent knocking at his studio door. He opened it to find Margaret Harrison standing in the downpour, her dark hair plastered to her face, her coat soaked through, her eyes wild with something that might have been anger or terror or both. Samuel pulled her inside immediately, grabbing a blanket from his storage closet to wrap around her shaking shoulders. He tried to ask what had happened, but Margaret could not seem to form coherent sentences at first. She stood dripping on his floor, clutching the blanket around herself, breathing in harsh gasps that might have been sobs or might have been something closer to rage. Finally, she managed to speak, and what she said made Samuel's blood run cold. Her father had shown them the photographs 3 days ago, Margaret explained in a voice that trembled with emotion. He had gathered the family in the parlor, Catherine, Margaret, Thomas, and little Emma, and had laid the prints out on the table one by one. At first they had all reacted as families typically did, commenting on how serious everyone looked, how still they had managed to remain, how professional the portraits appeared. Catherine had seemed pleased, suggesting they should have one framed to hang in the front hall. Then Jonathan had directed their attention to his pocket watch in the photograph. He had brought out a magnifying glass and passed it around, making each of them examine the reflection in the watch's polished surface. Emma had not understood what she was looking at and had quickly lost interest. Thomas had stared for a long time before handing the glass to Margaret without comment, his face carefully blank. Catherine had refused to look, setting the magnifying glass down and turning away, her expression stricken. But Margaret had looked. She had examined that tiny reflected figure with enormous care, and she had recognized immediately what her father wanted her to see. The posture, the way the figure stood, it was exactly how her mother had stood when watching her children, when observing family gatherings with that particular mixture of love and vigilance that Margaret remembered so well. Her father had been trying to give her proof that her mother was still present, still watching over them, still part of their family despite death and despite Catherine's presence in their home. Margaret's reaction, however, was not what Jonathan had anticipated. She had not felt comforted or reassured. Instead, she had felt manipulated and violated. Her father had taken her grief, her genuine love for her dead mother, and had weaponized it. He had used it to justify his own refusal to move forward, his own rejection of Catherine, his own determination to keep their household frozen in a permanent state of mourning. And he had done it by creating this photograph, this supposed evidence of Eleanor's continued presence, without considering what it would do to the people who had to live in that house every day. Because Margaret had realized something as she stood in that parlor looking at her father's triumphant face and Catherine's devastated one. She realized that her mother was not in that reflection. However the image had been created, whatever trick of light or chemistry had produced it, it was not Eleanor Harrison reaching back from death to maintain her place in her family. It was Jonathan's desperate need made visible, his refusal to accept loss transformed into something he could point to and say, "See? She's still here. I don't have to let her go." And in that realization, Margaret had experienced a moment of terrible clarity. She understood that her father's promise to her mother had become a prison for everyone in that house. It was keeping him from building any genuine relationship with Catherine. It was preventing the younger children from having a real mother rather than a caretaker they were discouraged from loving. And it was trapping Margaret herself in a perpetual childhood where she was expected to remain her mother's daughter forever, never growing or changing or accepting the natural progression of grief into memory and memory into peace. So Margaret had done something that shocked everyone in the room. She had picked up the photograph, the one that showed the reflection most clearly, and she had torn it in half. Her father had shouted at her to stop, but she had continued, ripping the photograph into smaller and smaller pieces, while Catherine gasped, and Thomas stared, and little Emma began to cry. When she was finished, Margaret had scattered the pieces on the parlor floor and told her father that their mother was dead, that she had been dead for 2 years, and that no photograph was going to change that fact. The argument that followed had been violent and terrible, Margaret told Samuel, though no one had struck anyone. Jonathan had called her ungrateful and disloyal, had accused her of dishonoring her mother's memory. Margaret had shouted back that she was honoring her mother by refusing to participate in this sick fantasy, that the best way to respect Eleanor's memory was to live fully in the present rather than trying to resurrect the past. Catherine had tried to intervene, to calm them both, but Jonathan had turned on her next, saying things that Margaret would not repeat, but that had sent Catherine fleeing to her room in tears. That had been 3 days ago. Since then, Jonathan had barely spoken to anyone in the household. He kept to his study with the remaining photographs, examining them for hours with his magnifying glass, as though he could find in them some answer or justification or escape from what Margaret had forced him to confront. Thomas had withdrawn into silence, and Emma clung to Catherine, finally sensing that something was terribly wrong. And Margaret had decided that she could not stay in that house anymore, could not be part of this anymore, needed to make her father understand what he was doing before he destroyed whatever chance their family had of healing. She had come to Samuel because he was the only person outside the family who knew about the photograph and what it contained. She needed him to explain how such a reflection could appear, to give her father a rational explanation that might break through his obsession. Because Margaret was certain, absolutely certain, that there was a rational explanation. Her mother was not in that watch. Her mother was dead and buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery, and what appeared in the photograph was something else. A flaw in the process, a trick of angles, something ordinary and explicable that her father had invested with meaning it did not actually possess. Samuel listened to all of this with growing horror, realizing the full extent of the damage that single photograph had caused. He had thought himself merely a tool in Jonathan's scheme, but now he saw that he had been an accomplice to something far worse than he had imagined. A family was tearing itself apart, and the instrument of that destruction was an image he had created with his own hands and his own skill. Samuel asked Margaret to sit down, to give him time to think, but the girl refused. She stood in the center of his studio, wrapped in his blanket, water still dripping from her clothes, and demanded to know how the reflection had appeared in the photograph. She needed facts, she said, not mysteries. She needed something she could take to her father that would prove this was all a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding of photographic processes that had been invested with significance it did not deserve. But Samuel could not give her the answer she wanted, because he did not have it himself. He explained as honestly as he could the technical aspects of photography, how light reflected off surfaces, how polished metal could act as a mirror, how cameras captured whatever was present in front of them during the exposure time. He told her that he had been alone with her family during the session, that no one else had been in the studio, that he could not explain the figure in the reflection through any normal means. Margaret's face crumpled at this, her fierce determination giving way to despair. She had been so certain that Samuel would have an explanation, something scientific and provable that would demolish her father's fantasy. Without that, she had nothing to offer him, except her own conviction that her mother was gone, and that conviction would never be enough to overcome what Jonathan wanted to believe. She sank onto one of Samuel's chairs, suddenly looking very young and very tired, and asked what she was supposed to do now. Samuel made a decision then that he knew might cost him his business and his reputation, but felt necessary nonetheless. He told Margaret about his conversation with Howard Pemberton, about Eleanor's deathbed promises, and Jonathan's obsession with fulfilling them. He showed her the letter her father had sent, letting her read Jonathan's own words about why he had commissioned the photograph and what he intended it to accomplish. And then he told her something he had been thinking about for days, but had not fully articulated until that moment. The reflection in the pocket watch, Samuel said carefully, was real in the sense that it appeared on the photographic plate and could be seen in the prints. But what it represented was not Eleanor Harrison reaching back from death. It was Jonathan Harrison's grief and guilt and desperate need made visible through a combination of circumstance, suggestion, and the human mind's tendency to find patterns and meaning in ambiguous images. The figure in the reflection was exactly what Jonathan wanted to see, which meant it was as much a creation of his expectations as of any optical phenomenon. Margaret listened to this with fierce attention, and when Samuel finished, she asked him a question that cut to the heart of everything. Did he believe her mother was in that photograph? Not whether it was possible, not whether he could explain it, but whether he actually believed that Eleanor Harrison's spirit or presence, or whatever one wanted to call it, had somehow inserted itself into that reflection. Samuel considered lying to comfort her, but Margaret deserved truth after all the manipulation she had endured. No, he said. He did not believe Eleanor was in the photograph. He believed Jonathan had wanted her to be there so desperately that he had found a way to see her in an ambiguous reflection that might have been nothing more than a trick of light and shadow. And he believed that once Jonathan had convinced himself, he had used every tool at his disposal, including the authority of photography itself, which most people trusted as objective and honest, to convince his family to see what he saw. It was not a haunting, it was not a miracle, it was a grieving man's refusal to accept loss, transformed into something that could hold a family hostage. Margaret stood then, handing Samuel back his blanket, her composure returning along with her determination. She asked if he would come to her house and tell her father what he had just told her. Samuel hesitated, knowing that doing so would violate every principle of client confidentiality and would almost certainly result in Jonathan making good on his threats. But he looked at this 14-year-old girl who had torn up a photograph because she understood that sometimes love meant letting go, and he agreed. They walked through the rain to the Harrison house on Commonwealth Avenue, neither speaking, both steeling themselves for the confrontation ahead. The house was large and elegant, its windows glowing with warm gaslight, looking from the outside like the home of a prosperous and happy family. Margaret let them in through the front door and led Samuel to the study where her father spent his evenings. She knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for permission. Jonathan Harrison sat at his desk, surrounded by copies of the photograph, each one showing his family frozen in formal pose. Each one containing that mysterious reflection in the pocket watch he held prominently displayed. He looked up as they entered, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been relief before settling on weary resignation. He asked what Samuel was doing there, though his tone suggested he already knew. Samuel explained as gently as he could what he had told Margaret, offering Jonathan the same explanation about grief and expectation and the human mind's desperate need to find meaning in loss. He told him about the danger of trying to hold on to something that needed to be released, about the damage being done to his living family in service of a promise made to someone who could no longer witness its fulfillment. He told him that Eleanor would not have wanted this, would not have wanted her children trapped and her husband paralyzed and her replacement tortured, all in the name of memory. Jonathan listened to all of this in silence, his hands resting on the photographs spread across his desk. When Samuel finished, the banker looked down at the images for a long time before finally speaking. He said that Samuel might be right, that everything the photographer had suggested might be true, but it did not matter. He had made a promise to his dying wife, and whether that promise had been wise or foolish, whether honoring it was helping or hurting his family, he was bound by it. He could not let Eleanor go because he had given his word that he would not. Margaret stepped forward then and said something that stopped everyone in the room. She said that their mother had released him from that promise the moment she died. Eleanor had asked for something impossible because she was frightened and in pain, and Jonathan had given it to her because he loved her and wanted to ease her suffering. But that promise had been fulfilled the moment Eleanor closed her eyes for the last time, knowing that Jonathan had agreed to try. Everything since then, the obsession, the photograph, the manipulation of his family, that was not about Eleanor at all. That was about Jonathan's inability to forgive himself for being unable to save her, for having to remarry, for continuing to live and build a new life when she could not. The room fell silent. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the house they could hear little Emma singing to herself while Catherine prepared dinner. Jonathan looked at his daughter, at this child who had somehow become wise beyond her years, and something in his face finally broke. He reached for the photographs on his desk, and one by one began tearing them apart, just as Margaret had done 3 days earlier. And as he destroyed the images that had briefly made him believe he could hold on to what was lost, he wept for the first time since his first wife's funeral, while his daughter held him and Samuel quietly left the room, knowing that some griefs could only be healed by the people who shared them. The pocket watch remained on Jonathan's desk, its surface reflecting nothing but lamplight and the ordinary details of a room where a family was finally beginning to heal. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.